I want to let you know that I have long pants on. For those of you who watch me, you know that I don't normally do that. But starting Thanksgiving until Easter, I go long pants. Then I go back. So anyway, I will be won't be giving presentations here on January and February, but it's really because I'm working on some books that I have to try to get done. We're trying to get 4 more books done to add to our collection, and so I really need to focus on that. So, just so you know that it's coming up. All right, so my name is David Schleper. I grew up in Shakopee starting when I was 2 years old. My parents moved here. My dad was a high school American history teacher. My mom was a teacher, and then she was also worked at the hospital. And there were 8 kids in the family. I'm number 4. I left when I was 18. I left. I went to Australia. I went to Colorado. I went to Hawaii. I went to Washington, D.C. I ended up being a teacher in D.C. for 25 years, teaching deaf students there. But I ended up coming back here, believe it or not. And mostly that was because my mom was here at that time. She started having Alzheimer's. It was getting worse. And you know, you're a good Catholic son, and I felt I had to come back and help out. So I did. And so I was there, and I ended up staying here. So today we're going to talk about the Mnísota River here in Shakopee. And really, basically, we're going to talk, as you can see, there's kind of a here's what we're talking about, but we're basically going to be talking about how people what it was like back then, and then the different things that came up throughout. It's interesting to know that Watpá, Mnísota was a Dakota name for the river. So this is what was called until the French, Canadian, and Medi people moved down here, and they tried to decide what the name of the river was, and they ended up calling it the River St. Peter. But it's interesting though, because even though it was called St. Peter's River, the people who looked at that said actually it really was just a mistake. They didn't need to say St. Peter's River. They really was trying to say Sans Pierre, which is this is my great spelling, so just so you know how we're speaking. But anyway, which really means without stones, and that the river in that area didn't have a lot of stones, and that's really why it was called that. But people thought it as St. Peter's River, taking it back to going to Saint, and doing that tie-in. So it was called that until 1852. And it was not until 1852 that it was called the Mnísota River. So just so you know, so there were other names for the river before then. Even before that, I'm sure it was something else too, but just that we know it's here. And so the river goes right through what was back then Tinta Otanwa. And as we talked about this before, who knows who've been here before, Tinta Otanwa was the Shakopee, Chief Shakopee's village. There were 600 Dakota Indians who lived here in Shakopee, starting probably in 1690 or so, and continued on. And they were first on the north side of the river, and then 1839 it moved to the south side of the river. And actually, if you look at Memorial Park, if you think of that, downtown Shakopee, near Dangerfields, over there, that whole area was part of the village. The village actually was from Somerville Street all the way to a little beyond Amazon, and about 4 miles towards the south. Okay, and so again, there were about 600 people who lived there. And one thing that we looked at is some of the people back then and what they called, and Dr. Charles Eastman, who's actually related to David Faribault and his wife. But anyway, he said that the canoes were really important part of what people used. And they called dugout canoes because they were made from large basswood, cottonwood, or soft maple trees. Okay? There's a picture of him. And he said it was shaped from a kind of light wood, always 2 in number, in order that they can have an extra on hand. Okay? And this is actually how you pronounce or say his name in Dakota. Okay? And he's pretty well known because he ended up getting a PhD. He started the Boy Scouts in the United States, and he's just an interesting person. And he's kind of related to Shakopee in a way because his, I think his grandmother lived in Shakopee for a couple of years. So we count that, you know. All right. And it's interesting because the Dakota boys learned how to fish, and the Dakota girls learned how to steer and paddle. Okay? Strongly and silently. So that's really how we did it. And so when you look at pictures, like I said, I looked at a picture here of here. You see the woman is up here paddling, and here she's with the thing. And it's also interesting because about 400 years ago, they found a remnant of a dugout canoe. This was in 1967 that it happened. They authenticated it, and they say it was probably built in the 1600s. So we know that dugout canoes happened, was here on the Minnesota River, and for a long time. And just so you know how they do it, they actually use fire to actually burn the inside of it. Okay. And it's been going on not just in Minnesota, but all over. This has been going on for about 10,000 years, just so you know. But then eventually, it became introduced to the modern iron tools, and it became common for the Dakota and other people in the Minnesota Valley area. And just to give you an example, this is downtown Shakopee. This was probably in 1890, I'm guessing, okay? Because this is the old bridge, which we'll talk about a little bit. But see, there's a little dugout canoe here too. So just so you know that it was happening all the way through. The other big thing that went down the Minnesota River was the keel boats. They went both up and down the stream. They really used it mostly for the fur trade. And again, the French and Medi people from Canada moved down into Minnesota area in order to trap. And then they sold those furs, and that's how they make their money. They were about 18 feet wide and about 60 feet in length. And I think I have an example of what they look like. Yeah. So it kind of looked like that. So they could put their stuff in there, they go through, and the reason it worked well is because it wasn't too big to get stuck down below. Because there were some rocks, but there were also just the mud from down. You can see it now, that's why you can't use it now, unfortunately. And the keel boats move about 15 miles per day. So it was pretty a slow process what was going on. And I know that they often said that going one way was fine, but going the other day was harder because the water's heading this way, so you're really having to use the oars. And then the other thing in the river that was used a lot was flat bottom boats. It was mostly used by farmers and traders. And it is interesting, they make this point, and I wish I could find a good picture of this, but they actually had like sheds or pen in the rear for horses and cattle. So it's interesting as they went through. And when they talk about that, they say that it was, it's used sometimes for like show boats for entertainment. There's the chapel boats for ministers. People who were doing photographs at that time would use that. And they even were floating brothels called gunboats. Now, I'm not saying that happened in Shakopee, however, it's a good possibility. All right. And though even the flat bottom boats were preceded by the steamboat, they still continued to use afterwards. And even in the 1850s, carried more goods and settlers to the Mnísota Valley area. And here's an example from the Shakopee story, this book here. And in there it talks about bringing logs and a stack of goods up the flat boat Wild Paddy. Tom Holmes soon had a log trading post built on the brow of the river bank. This was the first building in the original town site of Shakopee. It was a sort of block house built with the help of John Mackenzie, Emerson Shumway, and Daniel Apgar, who came with Holmes. Okay, and we've been talking a little bit about each of these people, but we will tie into John Mackenzie a little bit also. But Holmes was one of those people who decided he wanted to get land and sell land and make money. That's really kind of what he was doing. And so he realized that in order to do that, it was before when they weren't allowed white people in this area. But if you had a trading post, it was allowed, but you had to get permission to have a trading post in the area. So Thomas Holmes went in and asked to have trading posts in this whole area of the Mnísota River, and he was told no. So he went back and asked, can he have for 2 places? And they said yes. And that's why he ended the one in Shakopee and one in Chaska were from what he was doing. Okay. And then we had go into steamboats. And steamboats are really important and it's interesting because it was used so often for about 20 years in downtown Shakopee. That's where most people were arriving from the East Coast and eventually from Germany and other places, okay? The first steamboat was in, of course, what they called St. Peter's River at that time. It was in 1842. They had a group of people who were in St. Paul, and they had them drive from there to Tinta Otama, which again is the village here in Shakopee, with the 600 Dakotas who lived here, okay? That was the first time that they ever went there, and then there was none again until the 1850s. And after that, there was many, almost all summer long. So here's an example from Shakopee of people arriving at the downtown. This would be probably near Huber Park area, probably. But you look at just the people and they're all waiting. It was a big thing every time a steamboat would arrive in Shakopee, especially the first one of the season. And people would cheer and people would run down. They often would have bands playing. It was a big thing when that actually happened. And they used to have, like here's the, they would like advertise about steamboat excursions from Chaska and Shakopee to Fort Snelling back. Okay, and the Flora Clark was the one of the boats. There were probably about 90 different steamboats that were here. Flora Clark was an important one because that was built by someone here in Shakopee. The Spencers, actually. So you know Spencer Street, that's how that tucks in there. I also find it really interesting because this picture really shows how, of course there's wooden bridges here, but they were still having steamboats, but how they walk across into the thing. And this is one of the problems, well it's kind of a problem, to me it's a problem because we know there's at least 3 places where they had, where people would walk across to get off the steamboats. But we don't know exactly where because they just put these little things around like this and they just walk. You know, it wasn't like a big steamboat landing with the big, you know, malls there and stuff, you know, it wasn't that kind of thing. And so you can't tell exactly where, except you can tell the area. So like this one, for example, is the Thomas Holmes landing, probably. And I'll talk a little bit about that coming up. But so it's just interesting that, so we know where they kind of are, but we don't know for sure exactly. And there's no, at this point, there's no sign saying this is where the steamboats were landing. We will eventually do that here. The Shakopee Heritage Society is working on information about the history of Shakopee. And just so you are familiar, downtown in Memorial Park, if you go to what we call it the duck pond, which is other words when you go to Memorial Parks to the left and park there are 10 signs now that are up. And you go along the path and it talks about the history of Shakopee. And there's signs, a couple there that what they look like, but there actually are 10 of them that are now up. We're actually now adding kiosk signs about the Dakota, the Faribault, and the Pond family who were living here. And then we're moving on into downtown Shakopee and talking about what things were there that were kind of interesting. All right. The next thing that we're talking about is ferries. And while I talk about the ferries, I'm going to talk about a few that were not in Shakopee and then into Shakopee. And the reason I'm talking because they were so important. The first one is the Bloomington Ferry. It was established in 1852. And it used to be, the reason why I add this is because most settlers were crossing from the north side of the river to the south side of the river, used the Bloomington Ferry. Okay, at that time that's where the path led, where you go across it. And it continued until about 1889, 1890. Then the next ferry that's as it moves towards Shakopee is the Hennepin Ferry. And remember I talked about John Mackenzie, who was one of the people who helped build the first trading post in Shakopee with Thomas Holmes. John Mackenzie helped build an area in 1852. He built a ferry across there. Why that he's important in another way is because he also, several years later, I think in 1864, he snuck from here up through Canada, drugged Little Six, which was the third chief, drugged him, brought him back to Fort Snelling where he was hung. So the same guy. So it's just kind of interesting, it pops up in different things. We talked a little bit about that before, but I just want you to know. The Hennepin Ferry is not there anymore. There's not a Hennepin, Minnesota, but it's basically where Eden Prairie area, a little further there. So at that time, it was until 1857 when there was a big crash. a lot of people wanted to have towns all over the place. So they would have what was called paper towns, where it was written, they'd actually have like the names of the streets and all that kind of stuff ready for people to buy into. And some people did. So there was a sawmill, a grift mill, a blacksmith shop, a ferry, a few houses. But then eventually it just disappeared. Okay? It wasn't the best place. Shakopee was smarter to go a little further into Shakopee, and that's why I continued there. And here just a good example, just to show what the ferries would look like, you know. And they basically go from one side of the river to the other side of the river. Again, before we had, of course, the building eventually will be a bridge. But before there was a bridge, this is how they got back and forth all the time.
Did you have to pay to use?
Yes, you did have to pay. And I'll talk about that in the next one, okay, if you don't mind. Because I'm glad you remember that. I remember this one. This is Major Richard Murphy's ferry. And if you think now, if you remember what is the landing, which is a little east of Memorial Park is the landing. And in that area is where the house of Richard Murphy's. And they had a ferry. He actually moved in, he settled in Eagle Creek, which is now part of Shakopee, but that area. And then he got a license to operate his ferry in 1854. And that is what he looked like. That's actually a picture of him. He built this stone inn. It's not there anymore, but the foundations are still in the landing. But it was also a wharf for steamboats. And they also had a huge barn, and they farmed about 900 acres. But this is true, and this is what I talk about, you think. People would stop in midstream to collect fares. And if they couldn't pay, he was said to have personally thrown them in the river. And I believe that's true, actually. If I know enough about what I have known about him, it's a possibility. And also, it's interesting because during the Battle of Shakopee, which happened in 1858, where there was a fight between the Dakota and the Ojibwa. The Ojibwa were further north. Dakota were in this area, and they ended up having a war that was happening. What's interesting is that there was a little landing area, so a lot of people in downtown Shakopee would actually go and sat and watched it all happen, because it was across the river, okay? And two of their sons, George and Benson, ferried 32 of the Dakota to the north side of the river to meet the Ojibwa and then start the thing. It lasted about 2 hours, the actual thing. And again, just another picture of a ferry. I don't know for sure that this is in Shakopee. And then the next ferry in downtown was the Luther M. Brown's ferry. They said it's probably a mile below Holmes Street. But some people think it's more west. But some people think it's more east. So when I talk about, well, where the evidence? We don't have the evidence because the water has flooded and then de-flooded and whatever. So we don't really have exactly where it is. Well, we knew that he arrived in Shakopee in 1853. He was admitted to the bar. He became the first judge here in Shakopee. And the ferry was popular until the Lewis Street swing bridge was built in 1878. And then finally the other ferry that's in downtown is the Thomas Holmes ferry. And that was on Cass Street in Shakopee. So you know where we're talking about. So go downtown, if you look, go that way, which is west. A few things over, and you'll find what's called Cass Street. And that's where we know that is where their ferry was. Again, we don't have really any evidence of that, except that he did talk about it, so we know. And they say that basically it was located west of downtown in order to accommodate settlers on the north side of the river who wished to trade at his trading post. His trading post was basically on right next to the river, but on Holmes Street, if you want to think about it in terms of what is now Holmes Street. And John Hare was actually the one who actually ran it for him. They do know that ferries had to be at least 1 mile apart from another one. So that's why they're not sure exactly where. And but I just wanted you to know that we do know that there were at least 3 ferries here in Shakopee area. Now let's talk about the ferry accident. There were more than one, but this was in September 29th, 1894. These 2 people, Louis and Elizabeth, got married at St. Mark's. Okay? And it's important to know them. Okay? And they lived, actually, if you want to look at, they lived at Medeiros Farm, which is located here. So here's the city of Shakopee, at that time, the small area. So this is all lakes or whatever. Now this is all part of Shakopee. But it was right here is where the he had his farm. And they had 5 children: Mary Catherine, Anna Catherine, John Henry, William John, and Mary Elizabeth. And here's actually a picture of that. So what happened was the family, including the 5 children and a sister-in-law and the parents, went to the Chaska Fair. In order to go to the Chaska Fair, they had to take the ferry across. Okay? Louis might have been drunk. Now it's interesting because I read several newspaper articles. Some of them make it sound like he's really drunk and others not. So it's hard to say. But we do know that he was driving pretty fast. He was heading back to Shakopee, so he's going back on the ferry again. He's not there yet. He's blocked from the river. And they do know that this person from the oil company told him to slow down. So we do know that he was probably driving too fast. But he continued to drive fast, whipping his horses furiously. And the horses kept prancing and jumping. And then they ran down the bank to the ferry. And he was trying to control them, but they rushed down, broke the gate, and the horses, the wagon, and all of the occupants headed into the cold and angry river. There was a man there who was in charge of the ferry, Chris. He said he ran to the scene, but he could only see Lewis clinging to the wagon box and crying for help. So he's alive. And again, they rowed out to the ferry, to Lewis. The one paper note that he was too under the influence of liquor to realize what happened. So, is that true? Probably. That's just my guess. He's gone to the fair. They probably had a little drink. but they were looking for the bodies. And they said the horses and wagon were found at the bottom of the river, at the end of the ferry, in 15 feet of water. The body of his wife Elizabeth, her sister, and the 5 children were all found in 15 feet of water. And they said it was really hard for the undertaker, having all those people. So then, of course, what happens next, if you look at the newspapers, they say they arrested him, and they tried to decide, and they finally came up with saying that it was actually, he came to her death by an accidental drowning in the Mnísota River. So is that true? Or did he do it? Hard to say. But what we do know is that he ended up moving into his wife's parents' house. So they clearly accepted it, right? Until he married again. And then they had 4 other children. So just kind of an interesting story about them. And if you look at the diary of Daniel Storr, who he did a diary of almost every day from when he first arrived in Shakopee, he talks about it one time where he talks about that. He drove there, he got drunk, he notes, and drove off the ferry boat into the river. His wife and her sister and 4 children, there were actually 5, were drowned, and he was not drowned himself. So, that's a good example of how we look at several different places to find evidence. So we look at the newspapers, we look at the diaries and stuff like that to see what we have. So that's what we know about that. But it is kind of sad, obviously. It's also interesting, we look at like fishing in the Mnísota River. This is in 1860, and someone writes about this also. And it says this person, her name is Condi Ragu, I think. I can't know how to say that. But anyway, he grew up on the north side of the Mnísota River, in other words, which was probably what later became Eden Prairie in the 1860s. He said that first winter when we got there, my father sent me and the hired man, whose name was Isaac, to get a load of hay. He said at that time, the only hay that was available was on the lowlands and was very long. And my brother Harry tagged along. So they're up on the bluffs, they're heading down towards what is then will be Shakopee. He said he looked down at the meadow onto one of the rice lakes, and there is a place called Rice Lake. There was rice that was there for that the Dakota used. And then they saw a group of men, boys, Indians, and children. I kind of like how they say that as men, boys, Indians. What? Some of the Indians, men and boys? But anyway, and children. Okay, and he said, Isaac, remember the hired hand, said, we go fishing. So we all went down to the lake and promptly forgot all about the hay. Both the white men and the Dakota were equipped with forks, ready to grab the fish. The fish came up to the water to breathe. We followed the crowd's example and kept it up all day until about 5 o'clock. An Indian woman asked me to eat some of the fish, but as they hung the fish upon the spears over the fire without removing the entrails, I declined. But the fish was perfectly roasted. In the end, I tried it. They were so delicious, I ate a great many of them. The mercury was 22 degrees below zero, but with the fire, we didn't notice the cold. And she also says, and this again is somebody's diary from 1870, says they had so many fish, black bass, walleye pike, and pickerel, but no bullheads or sunfish, that it ended up being about 1 1/2 ton of fish.
No wonder there's no fish around now, right? They were told to pack the fish in oats and they would keep indefinitely, where the winter was very cold. And she said they packed them in the oat bins until we thought we had enough to last the winter. And then they took the rest of them to St. Paul, where we were sold them for a good price. So it's just kind of interesting what was happening back then. And obviously, people use the river. Another thing that's really interesting is the Lewis Street swing bridge, I should say. It was built starting in 1878. It actually was opened in 1880. And here's a look of what it looked like. And it's important to understand the person who really helped build it. His name was Peter, I'm just gonna say Peter. He was born in Germany, and he moved to America in 1851 and into Shakopee in 1855. They ended up getting married to Amelia, and they had a general store between 1st and 2nd Avenue and Lewis Street. And that Lewis Street is important. It was for groceries, dry goods, boots, shoes, hats, caps, dress goods, clothing, and crockery. The store was opened in 1857. And he was very popular, and the store was very popular. He became Board of Trade president. He also became mayor of Shakopee in 1873 to 1876, and again in 1878. Meanwhile, the state says you can build a bridge, okay? And so, remember, Peter's store was on Lewis Street. So the people in Shakopee wanted to build the new landing on Fuller Street. Peter says no. So they voted yes. He turned it down. They tried it again. There's probably, I would say, for at least a year in the newspapers, they talk about this problem and the fact that the mayor basically says no. It has to be on Lewis Street. Why does he want to be on Lewis Street? Because the people from the other side will come right into his store, right? So he said, so they went back and forth, and finally, they finally built it on Lewis Street, okay? Eventually, they ended up, the Holmes Street Bridge was built in 1927. And this was, the Lewis Street Bridge ended up as foot traffic for a while. And then in 1942, with a war effort, they needed the metal. So they took about 100 tons of metals from what used to be the Lewis Street swing bridge. Anyway, for bombs, jeeps, and ships. But you often see pictures, and that was the bridge, the old bridge, okay? So this is not Holmes Street Bridge, this was still the Lewis Street. And here you see people fishing here, and in the background again is the bridge. All right. In 1905, another thing that was really important about the Minnesota River was the use of ice. Remember, at that time they didn't have refrigerators. They eventually had ice boxes, but they had to get ice, and they did that during the winter time on the river in downtown Shakopee. This actually is a picture from 1905 where they make a little path thing and they cut off the things of ice. And so they go along and they do that. They pack it with insulation, usually straw or sawdust, and it would be frozen for many months. Often it would be there through the next winter. So in other words, it worked pretty good. I can't believe that it could last so long, but apparently the walls were like really thick. That helped, and it was low down. Anyway, I do know when you look in the 1920s, Frank and Leo Siebenauer had the ice business. Okay, there were others before then. And he said the cost for delivery was about $2.50 for a 500-pound coupon book. And children would also come, and while they were doing that, they would always chisel off a few for the kids, because they like to have ice, right? And for large orders, it was about $4 per ton. And it's just interesting to know about, in terms of the history, this is in the 20s, they said the places that delivered for included Barney Jensen's and Charles Hartman. They had a meat market downtown. And they had the Hams branch, you know, of the beer, Hams beer. They had that in downtown Shakopee too. And the one they said that was most, that they used most was for the Redmond Ice Cream Factory, which is on the northwest corner of First and Holmes Streets. Now, where would that be now? Look downtown, Holmes Street, north side, northwest side, so it's over here, right? There's right there is what? Is the highway, because they tore down all those buildings that used to be there. But before then, at this time, there was the Redmond Ice Cream Factory. And in fact, a lot of people talk about when they were young, they remember that they used to go there for their field trip. And they always loved it because at the end they each got ice cream treats. And again, they made this little thing to eventually to go from the river over a side into what was the ice house. Okay. And that used to be located, I think, right by the old feed mill in downtown Shakopee. Some of you may remember that. For some reason, I do remember that, so it must have been around at least in 1962-ish. You know, so before it was torn down the building.
That's about a 1950 international truck.
Yes, I think that picture was 1950, yeah. Now, drownings in the Minnesota River, there were a lot, you know, because you have the river, kids especially would go there and go swimming, okay? And here's an example. This was on June 2nd, 1905. Joseph Ryan was drowned in the Minnesota River while swimming. And this is actually a picture, it's not very clear, but this is where they're actually looking for his body. And the superintendent of Union High School, and you know where Union High School is? Anybody remember?
Fifth and Lewis.
Fifth and Lewis is where now it's the family thing. You know, I talked about that. It used to be the old Central Elementary, is what we used to call it when I was growing up. Okay, but anyway, he used to talk about him afterwards and said Joe was a fine young man of excellent habits and clear character. He was a universal favorite with all of his schoolmates. His sunny smile and face made all of us better and happier. But he ended up being buried here in Shakopee. They said it was the largest group of people in a church for that at that time, and was buried at what was then the new Catholic cemetery. Okay. Here's another one. This is in 1916, and it talks about Edward Cooper was swimming in the river, and he couldn't get to shore. He became exhausted and sank. But as he reappeared, he called for help, and someone across the bridge, Charles, came, dived from the bridge, brought the man to safety. So that was pretty lucky situation there. And here's another one that just is kind of sad in some ways. This was in 1916 also, but they said a stranger he could not be learned what his name was. He was drowned in the Mnísota River on Sunday afternoon. He came here from St. Paul last Friday, and he was employed as a laborer at the William Ryan Farm. He supposedly went bathing, and being unable to swim, sank to his death. And again, they found the thing. He ended up, recovered the body, but they still didn't know who his name was. So they ended it up in Valley Cemetery in the Potter's grave, one of the Potter's grave in Shakopee. Holmes Street Bridge was built in 1927. I'm just going to go pretty quickly through here, but I just want you to see what it looked like while we were building it. I just find it really interesting to see the people building the bridge, as well as for me, because I'm working on the book right now, several of them are African Americans, so I just find it really interesting. I don't know where they're coming from, but it's interesting. And the bridge, is there, it's still there, but it's no longer used for cars. It's just a walking bridge. You can walk across the river there. And when I was young, people used to go underneath the bridge like this, across to the other side, and would get caught every once in a while by the police. Not me, I'm just talking about other people.
They're still doing that.
And they probably are, yeah, you're right, they're probably still doing it. I actually am not surprised. I'm also going to just talk about floods, but very shortly, because I gave you a paper that has more information about some of the things. But I just want you to know that floods have been in the downtown forever. Okay, it's almost a regular occurrence. We just know that it happens. In fact, I'm going to switch this next part, but look at, you just look at some of the pictures. This is the 1929 flood. This is down by what used to be Riverside Park area. Here's where down what used to be in Huber Park, used to be a place there. And you'll find pictures like this, and of course, back they added the next one, because it got higher and higher. They used to have people coming and put signs up, and they'd look at to see which one was the worst. We know that, of course, with Riverside Park, that was a big thing. It's important because people used to go on boats and ride around the Riverside Park, so you can see a little boat in there, I think. And that's why they eventually moved that Riverside Park to Watpá Park, where the George Schleper Stadium is, because of that. So I just want you to know that flood happens, and happen all the time. And now if you look downtown, where the new Lewis Street Bridge is, which is not as the old one, but the new bridge is higher up. And all the way down there is higher up, and that's because of the floods. And it seems to work pretty well now, so there's not a problem. It doesn't go too far, although like Huber Park and stuff still will get flooded almost all the time. And even like Valley Fair would get flooded, it's kind of interesting pictures. All right. Then I'm going to go to the next thing, is the excursion boats and the sundown dancing. This was about 1915 here in Shakopee. And what we know is that there was, at that time, it was very popular to take a boat, go from downtown Shakopee to St. Paul, and then take a train back to Shakopee. And at that time, you could do that. You could go get with a train. So they used to do that all the time. And I know that, well, actually, I guess they started to Shakopee, arrived to Shakopee, and then in the evening they headed back. And the boat had a barge in back with bands playing in the moonlight. It was very, very popular. And it's actually, you can see, where they have these two things together like this. Okay. And once they got to St. Paul, the kids would take a train back to Shakopee. But the pastors, the priests in Shakopee were not happy because all of these people were dancing all night to St. Paul and then take the train back. And so he would talk, the priest would, and the end pastors would talk at their homily, I guess, and basically said, stop it. It's not good, it's not good. You're going to go to hell or whatever, right? So that was fine, except what that caused was all the people decided they wanted to go even more because it must be good if this. So it became even more popular, and so it was for several years that they would do this. One thing that was really interesting is one time when they came to St. Paul, they arrived late and they missed the train that goes back to Shakopee, so they had to stay overnight in St. Paul. I don't think the parents were very happy. And so that's just an interesting story of what they used to do in downtown Shakopee. That was the fun in 1915 to about 1920 or so. And it was very popular. I wish they could still do something like that because it was kind of big fun, actually, I have to say. But the river has now become so, the mud, and stuff like that, they really have to dredge it again, and they don't seem to be willing to do so at this point. Another thing, in 1926, Shakopee was considered the turtle capital of Twin Cities. So, they said that people used to trap turtles commercially and sold them throughout the Twin Cities and beyond that. And Pat Thieland, who eventually became the cop here in Shakopee, right? They said he used to remember, I used to trap turtles with my dad in 1926 when I was about 10 or 12 years old and began to market them commercially in the 1930s. He said it was not uncommon to find 7 or 8 turtles in one trap. And they often rounded up between 60 and 70 turtles a day. Okay. Now they weren't making that much money, but over time they did more. Now it's changed now because now laws, because there were problems and the turtles were disappearing, right? But it's just interesting. It's also interesting because he says one time that turtle meat tastes something like frog, but it has a beefy taste to it as well. I guess it tastes different to everybody. And it used to be at St. Paul's house downtown, they would have turtles as a thing in the menu, very common. Okay. And then finally, another one that's very interesting is what is called the Bare Ass Creek. I don't name that, the person named it. This was in 1950. Okay. And this is important to remember too. It used to be that the sewage went directly into the Minnesota River. That is really gross when you think about it. Okay, over where Hubert Park is now located. And John Siebenauer used to go skinny dipping behind Growler Dello's house. He said, John says, you have to keep an eye out for turds floating down the river. Yes. Yeah.
We, as young kids, we used to always swim in Robert Elmo's creek, we called it. And during high water, one time there was 3 of us. Of course, we never wore swimsuits. The log came floating down the river. We went out and hung on it, and we took it as far as the NYA camp, about half mile down. Not realizing that if you're down naked, you gotta walk back.
Right, exactly. It is just it's a great story. I mean, when he told us, I said, now I have to show this because I think it's so interesting. He says too, and this is probably you are probably involved in this too, they used to have a rope swing and used to swing over the river into the murky water below. And he also says that he knows that he does not know that his parents actually knew that he was swimming in the river. He remembered drying off before going home. But of course, the clay mud would stick, and even busy parents would have to know what was happening. So it's just interesting in terms of looking at stories about the Minnesota River. And it is a really important part of downtown. And I think they're doing more to promote that because we feel that the river is a good part of the history of Shakopee. Finally, just to let you know, I think on one of the papers on the back is the Shakopee Heritage Society newsletter. If you're interested in joining, it's $10 a year or $15 for couple. The reason I mentioned it is that the next 4 issues, which will be the 2019, I was going to say it. Anyway, the 2019 year is focusing on events down in downtown Shakopee. The first one is the Holmes Street and the fire in 1879. The next one will be the bridge that we just talked about a little bit here. Then we're talking about the First Avenue and the big bank robbery that happened back then. And the last one, I think, the next issue, because it comes up once every 3 months, is focusing on the railroad. So they're just interesting, a lot of good articles in there, and it's free, or not it's free, it costs money, I guess, to join, but it's a good thing to do it to support the place. And then finally, just, in terms of presentations, coming up, like you said, I'm going to be gone, or not here, I should say, January and February, except January 12th, we'll be doing the Sweet Home Dwellings in early Shakopee. So some of you may have been there, but if not, it will be in the library. Then March 12th, we will have, we're strong, it's more women in early Shakopee. Then March 16th is in the library on industry in early Shakopee. Back here on April 9th, we'll be on African Americans in early Shakopee. April 13th will be on churches in early Shakopee, that's in the library. So these are the ones coming up, and we'll usually put that in the Shakopee Valley News about that also, as well as probably in the thing. But just wanted to let you know so that you know that. And let's see. And there's information, I think you have that information about if you have any questions or have any stories or information you want to share. And that's our short information about the river here in Sakpe.
So what do you think about what they're going to be doing along the river area?
Well, it's interesting. They have this 2040 plan, and in there they're looking at having a little bit more things that happen down in the river area, buildings, things that will tie into that, having more people down there and more events that ties into the river.
It's gonna disturb the homeless people that are camping.
Eventually they need to work on that
And the
anyway.
building is not for
Yeah,
people with low income.
right. But there is a plan to eventually, that's one of there's certain things that they want to do in order to make sure we're taking care of all people, right? So that will be an important part of that too, I think. I know that one of our council members is here, so I know she's quite aware of it. Okay. Oh, finally, on your paper, one of the papers should have on the back a really small, I think, green.